Good day and welcome. Our presentation today is Ritual Form and Mythologization of Death in Wole Soyinka's Procession, written by Alufmi Dumede, from Creative Commons Library, Abstract. Critics make a large claim that Wole Soyinka mythologizes death and deploys ritual form in his dramatic works, but hardly account for the same in this light regarding his poetry, especially Procession, a sequence which bears so many marks of this style. Critics of Procession discount a lot from its richness in mythological and ritual forms but focus more on its topical, social and political nature. The trend in the criticism of the sequence is obviously informed by the historical and political context of the sequence and its inclusion in A Shuttle in the Crypt, 1972, a collection on Soyinka's prison experience. This approach to Procession detracts from the art in the sequence, fails to appreciate fully the poetry's formal properties, and so the poetry requires a close reading. Formalism is applied to study the poem, and the study stresses the analysis of the work as a self-sufficient verbal entity, constituted by internal relations and independent of reference either to the state of mind of Soyinka or the actualities of the external world. The approach highlights in a fresh manner the elements which the earlier criticism the poetry stresses to reveal Soyinka's mythologization of death and preoccupation with ritual forms in Procession. The study reveals that Soyinka is not just preoccupied with political imprisonment and judicial death but mythologizes the experience and treats rites de passage. It shows further the breadth with which the poet accentuates the esoteric theme through his deployment of devices such as symbols, the motifs of passage, biblical allusion, pathetic fallacy, pun, incantatory rhythm, paradox, irony and humor. Introduction. The best criticism of Procession has been largely political and hardly treated the two poems one as integral to the other. Though the critics of the poem occasionally pay insubstantial attention to the concern of the poetry with some rites, their evaluation of its ritual nature is vitiated further because the issues in one poem are not seen as integral to those in the other one. Procession I and Procession II are facets of the same experience and an exploration of death and rites. The relationship between the two poems informs Soyinka's titling one as a sequel to the other. The poet mythologizes death in the sequence, inaugurates a long series of rites, piacular and funeral, but focuses in the main on the rites of passage, reserving different parts of the poem for different aspects of the rites. Procession is therefore full of ritual elements which in turn highlight freshly many other formal properties of the poems that have either paled to insignificance or been misread in earlier studies of the poems. Procession is about death and rites of passage. In the poem, the persona mythologizes death, depicts characters and mourners as initiates involved in, and enacting a rite of passage, and gives many other elements involved in the enactment ritual overtones. The subject of the poem is a serious one and it is treated in a solemn and religious manner. The events in the poem are performed in an established or prescribed manner with the tripartite ritual structure of preparation, ritual death and rebirth. The words or acts constituting or accompanying the ceremony accentuate this ritual tone. Hanging Day treats preparation and ritual death while Passage focuses largely on the rites of passage for the dead, and the two are marked by ritual elements. Thus, the sequence can essentially be described as ritual poetry. Ritual poetry is a complex poetic genre and cannot be simply defined as that genre characterized by ritual elements. The nature of the poetry is inherent in the character of ritual itself, and so to define the genre, one needs to understand ritual as a subject. A ritual is a prescribed form or method for the performance of a religious or solemn ceremony. It can come in several ways, one of which is a rite of passage or rite de passage. Rite de passage is a ritual signifying a change in status in the course of life of an individual, as one marking puberty, marriage, or death. The solemn or religious ceremony is performed in an established or prescribed manner, and so are the words or acts constituting or accompanying it. It involves a form of death and is accompanied by a rite whose goal is rebirth or regeneration. Every rite of passage follows a basic structure. The three-part structure basic in rites of passage pattern is established by Hans Penner, in Madueka 275 entry into darkness, or preparation, followed by ritual death, which leads to a rebirth. Ritual clearly has links with myth and religion that its discussion always raises points about the two. In a study like this, however, the relationship between myth and ritual or myth and religion needs no elaborate discussion, but it suffices to simply state the relationship which three scholars have drawn between rites and these other phenomena. In the present study, understanding the nature of ritual, the links between ritual and religion, myth, religion and any phenomenon raised in the work of Penner, Campbell, Durkheim, Agunjimi and Naala help to put our discussion of ritual form in procession in a proper perspective. Campbell's submission, for example, that physical enactments form part of rites suggests that drama is an element of ritual, and it will not be surprising to discuss this element in procession. Granted the complex nature of ritual as discussed above, ritual poetry, as a term, is open to discussion and will refer to that poetry which reflects the many sides of ritual. Thus, names vary widely by which the poetry is described, depending on what features of ritual a theorist has in mind. Marjorie Bolton, 161, apparently has ritual poetry in mind in what she categorizes as incantatory poetry, the kind of poetry which seems to lend itself to chanting or solemn declamation. Its pattern may be patterns chiefly of repetition, the lines are usually long, the subject is treated seriously, with something of a prophetic or exalted manner, possibly some hint of ritual, of liturgy. Cutton's Dictionary of Literary Terms, 417, also links incantation to ritual, with incantation as a literary term referring to a formulaic use of words to produce a magical effect and to create an intensifying emotional temperature. The words may be chanted or spoken. It is very common in primitive literatures and is much used by sorcerers and witches, and also for ritual purposes as in a charm. Ritual structure in Soyinka's Procession. Procession has a ritual structure. Central to it is the tripartite structure characteristic of a rite of passage. The poem has the customary three-part structure, of preparation, ritual death and rebirth. Hanging Day treats preparation and ritual death while passage focuses largely on passage and rebirth. The preparation is depicted in the pervasive symbols of journey, darkness, flight and phenomenal events in the first section of the poem. The closing stanza of the section treats and summarizes the ritual death. Hanging Day captures the death of 5 prisoners and mythologizes this in different symbolic terms. Their death is suggested in at least 2 ways in the poem. Understated, their death by hanging is first hinted at in the persona's description of the 5 prisoners as bell ringers on the ropes to chimes of silence, 42. The death of the 5 is reinforced in the persona's reference to them as the wretches damned to the pit, 42. Passage examines the cyclic nature of existence and the philosophy that the death of the 5 in Hanging Day is not the end of life but the beginning of another one. The poem focuses on the rites of passage of the 5, conducted and attended by choric participants and communicants including the persona. The sequence read in relation to Hanging Day establishes the actions in the poem as enactments of a myth and on the question of ritual of passage. Like Hanging Day, passage also captures this experience through symbols of passage, light, flight, cryptogram and other formal ritual patterns related to or contrasted with the ones in the first section. Setting, symbolism and ritual elements in procession. The landscape of procession is, pars pro toto, walls in sunspots, 41, but is not without some symbolic overtones. The landscape evolves as the womb, grove of initiation or preparation for both the persona and the 5 prisoners hanged. For the persona, it is a place of preparation as a communicant in a piacular rite, and for the 5 as participants in a rite of passage. The logic of the symbolism is simple. The earth on which the 5 to be hanged walk is depicted as hollow and the prison as a pit, which echoes footsteps of the grave procession. One agrees with Madueke and Ahade that Soyinka puns off grave in the last image of confinement, and first, that the word acts as an epithet, and secondly, that it evokes the literal meaning of a burial place. The second meaning, therefore, reinforces the imagery of confinement in the poem. The imagery of a grave, 41, a hollow earth, 41, a pit, 42, a siege of darkness, 42, and that of confinement and encirclement, 42, resonant in the poetry makes the idea of live burial endure and suggests an element of ritual. The ritual symbolism inherent here will be clear, bearing in mind that the experience symbolizes the first part of the tripartite structure of a ritual and the entry into darkness, or preparation. In the instance, the imprisonment of all the inmates equates with the first part of the ritual experience, and the death of the 5 prisoners in Hanging Day is a form of ritual death whose ritual significance is developed subsequently in passage. Most certainly accompanying the hanging and the death of the 5 bell ringers therefore are phenomenal events suggested by the poet in at least 2 different ways. Soyinka's portrayal of the events in this light is misread as are other events about the incident. From inside the cell the poet sees a patch of the blue sky, the lushness of which gives a notion of heaven's and nature's indifference to human suffering. The penitent prisoners who used to disturb the community with their prayers are silent. Their ignorance of the dark deed about to be done is inexcusable, for the wall of prayer is not supposed to be blind. Adekoya 219. Admittedly, Soyinka's syntax could be complex as to make meaning ambiguous, but it is not the case in the present context. Granted the phenomenal event and the suspension of certain natural laws suggested in the image of the hanging day in procession, this study offers another meaning of the image of an eye patch largely blue, 41. That accentuates the idea that Soyinka mythologizes the death in the poem. The image has to do with the patch of sky seen by the persona without doubt, but is here described as thick and heavily depressed. There is an element of pathetic fallacy here, and the picture, contrary to Adekoya's submission above, reinforces the idea that the natural order responds to, and is affected heavily by the fate of the 5 prisoners. Bird symbolism and ritual form in procession. Bird symbolism is a major poetic technique deployed by Soyinka in procession, and it deepens the concern of the poem with ritual. The symbol, next to the motif of passage, appears pervasive. Finely wrought and not loudly announcing itself the way the motif of passage does in the sequence, bird symbolism pervades the entire sequence but is surprisingly identified by a Haid, 86, in an instance simply analyzed thus. The poet is the bird whose wings are wet but still does some lamentation. The symbolism in procession is complex and richer than the critic's evaluation of it, and has more to recommend it for ritual form. It has more to do with the human soul, and in many respects in the sequence the symbol weighs on the poem's preoccupation with soul travel and passage rites. All societies grant that every human body shelters an inner being, the animating principle of life that is regarded as the soul. The basic features of the soul are considered to be fixed but may be refined without adding anything. Truly essential and known to all religions is the whole system of collective representations related to the soul, its origin, and its fate, however crudely organized. Durkheim 185. But while every winged being is symbolic of spiritualization, the beliefs relating to the nature of the soul and its destiny are expressed in the interpretation of the bird as symbolic of the soul very commonly in folklore all over the world. In this context, Serlo, 26, 27, 28, states that birds are frequently used to symbolize human souls and that it is common in mythology to speak of the soul's journey. Campbell, 53, is helpful on the matter, especially on the origin of the soul, its nature and journey. Thus, the mythology of the 7 spheres and of the soul's journey from its heavenly home downward to its life on earth, and, when that life was done, then upward again through all 7, is as old in this world as our civilization. It must be noted also that while the distinct form and independence of the soul manifest themselves most clearly in death, the soul can leave the body also for brief periods. It is this temporary leave that the soul of the persona takes of his body to participate in the rites in procession. The persona in procession participates in the ritual, at largely a spiritual realm. Therefore, Soyinka presents the human soul as a bird in the poetry sequence. The bird soul symbolism recurs at least 3 times in the entire poem. The symbolism is first suggested faintly in the flight image in Hanging Day, 42. The association of the bird with the soul is reinforced subsequently in passage in the priest's words to the persona in the course of the rites, when he, the persona, is reminded of a childhood experience about the flight of bats and the shadow of ill it cast. The experience, if you pass under, trap a sky soul bird forward / your foot upon its shadow as it flies, is suggestive of bird soul symbolism. The experience suggests that the bats in flight were the souls of some people escaping, and that stepping on the shadows of the bats in flight would cause some birds to drop and thereby save the souls in flight. Soyinka suggests that there is a link between the childhood experience about the bats in flight and the present rites, and so the connection between the two requires a gloss. What Madueka, 51, states as a surrealistic leap into the world of childhood inhabited by old women working on the loom reinforces the present rites of passage and the souls of the five hanged men compare in the poet's imagination with the departing souls of some people, recalling the ones symbolized in bats during the childhood experience. The third bird symbolism, the one ahead, 86, simplifies as the poet, has to do with soul travel and relates to the persona, his attendance and performance at the final rites of the hanged prisoners. Spiraled on the unseen sunbeam. Pallbearer to hereafter, I attend. Mine the bedraggled wings. Raising a wind's lament to every step. 46. The persona attends the ritual and participates in it in the realm of the spirit, and it is therefore his soul which attends the rite. Ritual drama and the motif of passage in procession. The ritual nature of procession endures in Soyinka's focus in passage on the pre-transition rites for the dead and those of their initiation into the cult of the ancestors. Involved in the ritual drama are the women of the loom, the persona and perhaps others. In the second poem, two separate rituals are suggested as performed by the women of the looms. If one carefully follows the poet's deployment of tense and time sequence, one rite is distinguished from the other. One ritual was apparently performed by the women before the death of the 5 bell ringers. This ritual is set immediately below. Here old women spat their frail, sibilant juice, and time was essence of the bitter nut seeping from withered gums. We took their love, through intertwine of owlish fingers on the loom, they gave, and wove a spell against this hour, and kept a vigil upon dearth and death. The motif of passage, death and rebirth in procession. Procession is replete with the motif of passage. The motif pervades the poem from the beginning through to the end, the most obvious ones being the movement of the 5 prisoners through the passage on their way to the gallows and their procession through other passages during the ritual performance conducted for them. The ritual involves the women of the loom and other choric participants including the persona. The image of passage evolves at every stage in the poem as symbolic. In procession the image is symbolic of the preparation of the 5 prisoners for ritual death. The preparation and the ritual death are symbolically to be understood in the pervasive symbol of darkness in the first section of the poem, which is brought to a close by the ritual death hinted in the last stanza of Hanging Day. The point is made in the discussion of the symbolic nature of the physical landscape as advanced earlier in this study. The motif of passage is continued and made more prominent in procession too. Soyinka punctuates each phase of the ritual with the word passage and reinforces his concern with passage in other images. This ritual passage is marked by a movement from darkness into light through passages over a mound, past a streak of earth on whitewashed stones, through straits of mildew, before craters newly opened into space. Instructive about the concern with almost every passage is the question of death and renewal or rebirth, which the death of the 5 bell ringers is about. Consider for instance, the process of change or passage suggested in the opening lines of Procession 2. Passage. Earth is rich in rottenness of things. A soothing tang of compost filters through yeasting seeds, rain sodden, and festive fermentation, a sweetness velvety as mead and maggots. Intrinsic to the idea of fermentation in the lines above is the question of passage from death to life or vice versa. The images define the vital motion of the earth, decaying seeds grow mold and yield another life. Against the decay is the process of growth, and suggested is the idea that yeasting seeds are emblems of the earth which is constantly in motion. The image of life in the concern with the growth on the seeds. The poet requests the need to look beyond the surface that we may understand the profound nature of things. Shade your sight from glare / of leavings on the mound. The feast is done. In the motif of passage above, Soyinka juxtaposes the images of life and death, sustains the paradox of existence, and suggests that the death of the 5 prisoners is the beginning of another life. Incantatory elements in procession. Procession is rich in elements of incantation, and this element enhances its ritual nature. The elements are in the poet's deployment of repetition laced in some instances with rhetorical questions. The repetition in Hanging Day is inherent in its repletion in rhetorical questions, shortly after which the incantatory element is played up in the repetition of passage punctuated with "the feast is done." The effect of the repetition is the solemn atmosphere it gives, which supports the serious nature of the subject. Procession treats a serious subject. It is on death, and the phenomenon is mythologized by the poet. Soyinka accentuates his preoccupation in the poem with religious elements, the patterns behind thinly veiled allusion but loud in the motif of passage which is characteristic of ritual. Elements of the religious are present, but their disclosure is delayed in the elaborate motif of passage introduced in passage, in the first half of a stanza. Passage. A finite step is turned aside to spare a beancake hive, swarm of ant foragers. Do not these hold a vital motion of earth? The religious elements are disclosed in the second half of the stanza. Grooves in beancake scored with identations of the carious creed of priesthood, how well we know them, inheritors of the stricken hearth. Here Soyinka reinvents one common and popular religious idiom and locates same into the context of the procession suggested in the lines before. In the first half of the stanza, Soyinka sustains the ritual nature of the poem through his deployment of the incantatory and formulaic use of passage, which he follows immediately with a ritual thesis or passage. In the second and final half of the same stanza, the poet reinforces the ritual thesis by deploying a religious element and reinventing "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth," one of the Beatitudes, and a series of statements by Christ about those who are blessed. In the new context, Soyinka puns on hearth, and the ant foragers are the priests. Conclusion. Procession is a sequence in A Shuttle in the Crypt, a collection of poems on Soyinka's prison experience. The context of the poetry makes its study from historical, political and biographical perspectives most appealing to critics. The critics recognize several major properties of the sequence which are given perfunctory examinations. Procession remains, however, a work of literature, and the application of formalism to it establishes its literariness and major properties. In the words of Rivkin and Ryan, while procession creates a semblance of prison experience, a hanging and death, the devices in the poetry sequence suggest a persona's personal mythology on death. Creation of personal mythology in poetry is not new in itself, as scholarship reveals that some poets usually create their own personal mythology and that there recur in their poetry certain images. The idea is put by Bolton, 139-40, thus, many poets have favorite images that recur in their poems. This vision of Soyinka in Idenra and other poems also extends to Procession, whose preoccupation supports the poet's personal mythology on death. In Procession, Soyinka mythologizes death and creates a ritual. Death in the poem holds a promise of renewal. The poet depicts death as inevitable and suggests its agency only varies. In the poem, the agency of death is the state political machinery, the victims are the 5 bell ringers, but the issues involved are rites, piacular and funeral. The poet reinforces his preoccupation with ritual by exploring in the poem the tripartite structure of ritual, preparation, ritual death and rebirth, and strengthens same by also deploying ritual forms such as motifs of passage, religious allusion, bird soul symbolism, pathetic fallacy, repetition and other incantatory elements. We have come to the end of the presentation. Thanks for watching. Please, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and visit our website for more articles. Goodbye.